What happens when Hollywood's most respected character actor sits down with late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Josh Brolin, the man who's brought iconic villains like Thanos to life, finds himself face-to-face with Stephen Colbert in what would become one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a complete meltdown that exposes the dark side of entertainment industry power dynamics and leaves one of America's biggest stars storming off stage in disgust. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two of entertainment's biggest personalities clash in the most dramatic way possible. The Ed Sullivan Theater buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as audience members settled into their seats, completely unaware they were about to witness television history in the making. The familiar opening music of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert filled the air, and the host emerged with his trademark smirk, seemingly in high spirits as he delivered his opening monologue. But there was something different in his demeanor. Tonight, a sharpness, an edge that regular viewers might have missed, but would soon become impossible to ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, my next guest is an actor who's terrified audiences as one of Marvel's most powerful villains and who's brought incredible depth to some of cinema's most complex characters, Colbert announced with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Please welcome the incredibly talented Josh Brolin. The audience erupted in applause as Brolin emerged from backstage, his imposing frame filling the space as he walked toward the interview area. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, the actor carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades navigating Hollywood's treacherous waters. His weathered face bore the kind of character lines that spoke of a life fully lived, and his eyes held an intensity that had made him perfect for playing everything from comic book villains to complex anti-heroes. As Brolin approached the desk, something subtle but significant happened. Instead of the warm, welcoming handshake that typically marked the beginning of these interviews, Colbert remained seated, offering only a cursory wave. It was a small gesture, but in the world of television, such details matter enormously. Brolin's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that suggested he'd registered the slight, even if the audience hadn't quite caught it yet. "Josh Brolin, everybody," Colbert said, his voice carrying an undertone that seemed just a bit too sharp, a bit too performative. "Thanks for coming on the show. I have to say, watching you play Thanos was absolutely fascinating. Tell me, how does it feel to be universally hated by children around the world?" The question landed with an awkward thud. What should have been a light-hearted opener about his Marvel role instead carried an unnecessarily cruel edge. Brolin's smile faltered. For just a moment, but he recovered quickly, his years of media training kicking in. "Well, Stephen, I think kids are actually pretty smart," Brolin replied, his voice measured but with a hint of steel beneath the surface. "They understand the difference between a character and the person playing them. Unlike some adults, apparently." The comeback was subtle but pointed, and a few audience members let out nervous chuckles. Colbert's eyes narrowed slightly, the kind of expression that suggested he wasn't used to guests who could match his verbal sparring. Instead of moving on to safer ground, he doubled down. "That's interesting, because I've heard some pretty fascinating stories about your behavior on set. Word is you can be quite intense when you're in character. Some might say difficult to work with." The atmosphere in the studio shifted palpably. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was becoming something else entirely. Brolin leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening slightly as he processed what was happening. The audience, sensing the change in energy, began to murmur among themselves. "I think you might be confusing me with someone else, Stephen," Brolin said, his voice still controlled but now carrying a warning tone that anyone familiar with his work would recognize. "I take my craft seriously, but I've never had any significant issues with cast or crew members. Maybe you should check your sources before making accusations on national television." But rather than backing down, Colbert seemed energized by the pushback, leaning forward with the kind of predatory gleam that suggested he smelled blood in the water and was ready to go in for the kill. "Oh, I think my sources are pretty reliable, Josh," Colbert said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "In fact, I've been doing some digging into your past, and there are some fascinating patterns that emerge. Tell me, how do you reconcile your public image as this thoughtful, artistic actor with some of the more colorful incidents from your younger days?" The question hit like a sledgehammer. Brolin's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His shoulders tensed, his eyes hardened, and for the first time since sitting down, he looked genuinely angry. The audience fell completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something that had crossed a line from entertainment into something much more personal and uncomfortable. "Excuse me," Brolin's voice was low, dangerous. "What exactly are you implying, Stephen?" Colbert, seemingly oblivious to or perhaps thrilled by the shift in atmosphere, pressed forward with reckless abandon. "Well, there was that arrest in your 20s, wasn't there? And some pretty wild stories about your behavior during your marriage to Diane Lane. I mean, Hollywood marriages don't just fall apart for no reason, do they?" The color drained from several audience members' faces. This had moved far beyond the realm of typical late-night television banter. Brolin sat perfectly, still for what felt like an eternity, his breathing controlled but his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of decades of hard-earned respect and dignity. "Stephen, I'm going to give you one chance to walk that back," Brolin said, each word carefully measured. "My personal life, my family, and my past struggles are not fodder for your entertainment. I came here to talk about my work, not to be ambushed by someone who clearly has an agenda." But instead of recognizing the warning for what it was, Colbert seemed to interpret Brolin's restraint as weakness. He leaned back in his chair with a smug expression that would later be dissected frame by frame across social media platforms. "Oh, come on, Josh. You're a public figure. This stuff is all public record. I'm just asking the questions that everyone's thinking. Don't you think your fans deserve to know who they're really supporting?" The words hung in the air like poison. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and at least one person could be heard whispering, "This is wrong," to their companion. The camera operators, trained professionals who had seen countless interviews, exchanged concerned glances as they continued to capture what was rapidly becoming a train wreck in real time. Brolin's hands, which had been resting calmly on his knees, slowly clenched into fists. His jaw worked silently as he processed not just the attack on his character, but the calculated nature of it. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or an interview gone off the rails. This was a deliberate ambush, planned and executed with malicious intent. "You know what, Stephen?" Brolin said, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. "I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've worked with some of the most talented and professional people in the world, and I've also encountered my share of bullies and cowards. What you're doing right now? This isn't journalism. This isn't entertainment. This is just petty, vindictive cruelty disguised as comedy." The audience was now completely silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Colbert, perhaps finally sensing he had pushed too far, attempted to regain control with his trademark deflecting humor. Hey, let's not get too serious. Here, this is just a conversation between two guys who've been around the block, right? No need to get all dramatic about it." But Brolin was no longer having any of it. He stood up slowly, his full height and presence suddenly dominating the stage in a way that made Colbert look small and petty by comparison. "Sit down, Josh. We're not done here," Colbert said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. There was something in Brolin's posture, in the way he carried himself, that suggested this was a man who had faced down much worse than a talk show host with delusions of grandeur. "Actually, Stephen, we are done," Brolin replied, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. But before I leave, let me explain something to you and everyone watching. What you've done tonight isn't brave. It isn't clever. It's the behavior of a small, insecure person who thinks that tearing others down will somehow build himself up. Colbert's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger was impossible to tell. He glanced toward his producers off stage, clearly looking for some kind of guidance or support, but found none. The entire studio crew seemed frozen, unsure of how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. "You're being incredibly dramatic, Josh. I'm just doing my job here. This is what late-night television is supposed to be. Challenging, provocative, holding people accountable." Brolin let out a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. Holding people accountable? Is that what you call digging up decades-old personal struggles and throwing them in someone's face on national television? You want to hold someone accountable, Stephen? Let's talk about your accountability. Let's talk about how you've turned what should be a platform for entertainment and genuine conversation into your personal playground for psychological torture. The audience was now completely transfixed. Several people had their phones out, recording what they clearly recognized as a historic moment in television. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. What had started as Colbert's show was now completely dominated by Brolin's presence and moral authority. Colbert, desperately trying to regain control, attempted to interrupt. "Look, if you can't handle a little heat in the kitchen—" "Don't!" Brolin's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare try to spin this as me being unable to handle tough questions. I've been asked tough questions by the best journalists in the business. I've sat across from interviewers who challenged me professionally, intellectually, ethically. But what you're doing isn't journalism, Stephen. It's voyeurism, it's exploitation, and it's cowardly." The words hit their target with devastating precision. Colbert visibly recoiled, his carefully constructed on-screen persona cracking like a facade in an earthquake. For a moment, the mask slipped completely, and viewers caught a glimpse of something ugly underneath: petty jealousy, professional insecurity, and a cruel streak that had been masquerading as humor. "You think because you have a platform, because you have an audience, that gives you the right to humiliate people?" Brolin continued, his voice building in intensity. "You think that because someone's in the public eye, they've somehow forfeited their right to basic human dignity? Let me tell you something. I've made mistakes in my life. I've struggled, I've failed, and I've learned from every single one of those experiences. But I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and let you weaponize my personal growth for your sick entertainment." The camera operators, seasoned professionals who had covered everything from award shows to political debates, later admitted they had never experienced anything quite like this. The raw emotion, the genuine moral outrage, the complete collapse of the typical late-night format. It was unprecedented television. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Josh, please, let's just take a breath here. We can talk about this like adults." But Brolin was already moving toward the exit, his decision made. He paused at the edge of the stage and turned back, his final words cutting through the silence like a judgment from on high. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen?" Brolin's voice carried across the stunned studio with crystal clarity. "You had everything. You had talent. You had a platform. You had the respect of millions of people. And you've chosen to use all of that to become nothing more than a bully with a microphone." The words landed with devastating finality. Colbert's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and what might have been the first flicker of genuine shame he'd shown all evening. The audience sat in complete silence, many of them visibly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. "This conversation is over," Brolin declared. But as he turned to leave, Colbert made the fatal mistake of not knowing when to quit. "Running away, Josh? That seems to be a pattern with you, doesn't it?" Colbert called out, his voice carrying a desperate edge that suggested a man drowning and grabbing for anything to keep himself afloat. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Brolin stopped dead in his tracks, his entire body going rigid. The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the studio equipment seemed deafening. When he slowly turned around, his face bore an expression that would later be described by entertainment journalists as absolutely terrifying in its controlled fury. "What did you just say?" Brolin's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have managed. Colbert, perhaps finally realizing he had pushed too far, attempted to backtrack. "I just meant—" "No!" Brolin cut him off, striding back toward the desk with purposeful steps that made several audience members visibly flinch. "You don't get to just mean anything anymore. You want to talk about patterns? Let's talk about your pattern, Stephen. Let's talk about how you've built your entire career on punching down at people who can't fight back. Let's talk about how you've turned cruelty into comedy and convinced yourself that makes you some kind of social justice warrior." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Colbert's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, and, when he spoke, his voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. "How dare you lecture me about social justice? I've spent my entire career fighting for the things that matter, standing up to power, holding people accountable." "Standing up to power?" Brolin's laugh was harsh and humorless. "You think ambushing actors on your show is standing up to power? You think digging up personal tragedies and throwing them in people's faces is some kind of moral crusade? You're not speaking truth to power, Stephen. You are the power. You're the establishment. You're everything wrong with this industry wrapped up in a self-righteous bow." The exchange had moved far beyond anything that could be salvaged through editing or damage control. This was raw, unfiltered conflict playing out in real time, with no script, no safety net, and no way to take back what had been said. Colbert, now visibly rattled and struggling to maintain any semblance of control, made one final desperate play. "You know what, Josh? Maybe you should look in the mirror before you start throwing stones. At least I've never had the police called on me for domestic—" He never got to finish the sentence. The collective gasp from the audience was audible, as Brolin's face transformed into something that would have been perfectly at home in one of his most intimidating film roles. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the actor took a step closer to the desk. "Finish that sentence," Brolin said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more frightening than any shout would have been. "Go ahead, Stephen. Say it. Let everyone see exactly who you really are underneath all that fake righteousness." Colbert's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The bravado, the smug superiority, the cruel confidence, all of it had evaporated, leaving behind a man who suddenly realized he had awakened something far more dangerous than he was prepared to handle. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Brolin finally spoke, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. "You're a coward, Stephen. You can dish it out, but the moment someone stands up to you, you crumble. You hide behind your desk, behind your writers, behind your audience, thinking that makes you untouchable. But you're not. You're just a bitter, small man who's forgotten what it means to have integrity." Colbert made one last pathetic attempt to salvage his dignity. This is my show. You can't talk to me like this on my own show." Brolin's response was swift and merciless. "Your show? This stopped being your show the moment you decided to ambush a guest with lies and personal attacks. This became something else entirely. A public demonstration of exactly what's wrong with people like you. You think you're untouchable because you've got a platform and an audience, but platforms can be taken away, Stephen. Respect, once lost, is almost impossible to get back." The actor began moving toward the exit again, but this time his departure felt inevitable, final. As he walked, he continued speaking, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed studio. "I want everyone watching this to understand something. This isn't about me. This isn't about my feelings being hurt or my ego being bruised. This is about basic human decency. This is about the difference between holding people accountable and simply being cruel for entertainment value. What happened here tonight is exactly why people have lost faith in institutions, in media, in the very idea that there are still decent people in positions of power. Several audience members began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The sound built slowly, spreading through the studio like wildfire until it became a sustained ovation that drowned out any attempt Colbert might have made to respond. Brolin paused one final time at the studio exit, turning to face the cameras, directly. When he spoke, it was clear he was addressing not just the studio audience, but everyone who would eventually see this moment. To anyone watching this who has ever been bullied, who has ever been made to feel small by someone in a position of power, who has ever had their personal struggles weaponized against them, you don't have to accept it. You don't have to smile and pretend it's okay. You have the right to stand up, to walk away, to demand better. And to the people in this industry who think that having a platform gives them license to be cruel, tonight should serve as a reminder that your victims might not stay victims forever. With that, Josh Brolin walked off the set of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, leaving behind a host who sat frozen in his chair, an audience that continued to applaud, and a moment that would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform within hours. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Colbert's stunned expression and the continued applause from the audience before finally cutting to commercial. But the damage was done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across the internet like wildfire, with overwhelming support pouring in for Brolin and harsh criticism directed at Colbert's conduct. The incident sparked immediate and widespread discussion about the responsibility that comes with media platforms, the difference between legitimate interviewing and harassment, and the courage it takes to stand up to institutional bullying. Colbert's ratings plummeted in the following weeks. Advertisers began distancing themselves from the show, and industry insiders openly questioned whether his behavior had finally crossed a line from which there might be no return. The confrontation ultimately highlighted the importance of respect and professionalism in the entertainment industry, serving as a powerful reminder that fame and platform don't excuse cruelty, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply stand up and walk away.